So let me ask you this. How long have scientists known about cells, that they exist?
Hold on,
let's call them people. What do you think?
About 30 years.
30 years? Okay. I think you looked at the PowerPoint, didn't you?
I did.
Somewhere around 1660, which is almost 400 years ago, right? 350 years ago. Microscopes have actually been around a lot longer than you might think. Simple microscopes have been around for over 300 years. And that, we'll get to that. That sounds like a really, really, really long time. But in terms of like the history of man, 300 years is not very long. It's a long time for you, but in terms of the history of mankind, it's not a long time ago. But in the 1660s, this guy named Robert Hooke starts looking at a piece of cork, like you put in a bottle, right? Cork in a bottle. Where's cork come from? Where at in the tree? Where's the cork at in a tree?
The bark.
It's just under the bark. It's just underneath the bark.
I know you're
Usually it comes from oak trees. And Hooke looks at this under a simple microscope, which is really not much more than a magnifying glass. He's essentially looking at it under a magnifying glass. And what he sees is this like pattern of boxes in there. Would cork, is it alive? Probably like the cork you get out of a bottle?
Yeah.
It's probably been dead for a long time.
It was a lot.
So, well, it was alive at some point in time, but by the time he was looking at it, it was already dead. What was he actually seeing?
Cells.
Well, why did it look like little rooms, essentially, when you looked at little rectangles? What were you seeing?
What cells?
Because the cells were gone. I mean, they were dead, right? Well, what do plant cells leave behind?
Cell membrane.
They're walls. Okay? Plants have walls around them, right? They're cell walls. So he was seeing these little boxes, which are essentially like the walls of the cells that were left behind. Apparently, Hooke is the first guy who ever looked at that. And he went on to look at lots of other things under a magnifying glass. And he's the guy who actually said things are made of cells. He's the first one who used the word cell. Because back then, what do we call those religious people that like live in communities where like all the men all live in one place and they don't drink, they don't cut, they don't, they're
Illuminati.
yeah, they're called monks, right? You know the monks? Monks?
No.
And the monks lived in little rooms that were sort of shaped like that. So many like rectangular rooms. And Hooke saw it and said, that kind of looks like a monastery, the rooms in a monastery. They called them cells. And so he named them after these little rooms that monks lived in, cells. That's about as far as Hooke went. But another guy comes along a little bit later. It's about 10 years later, this guy comes along, Anton van Leeuwenhoek. He's from somewhere in Europe, I'm not sure where. He's famous with a lot of science because he's really good at making lenses for light microscopes. So that's what he became famous for first. He was making these lenses. He's a really good lens maker. But everybody knew that Leeuwenhoek was a little crazy. And all the scientists in Europe knew he was a little nuts. So one day, apparently, Leeuwenhoek gets this bright idea that he's going to use some of these lenses that he's made to look at a drop of pond water. So he takes this drop of pond water, puts it on a slide or something, a piece of glass, and he looks at it with one of his microscopes. And apparently he saw something there that nobody had ever seen before. What did he see in that drop of pond water? Maybe not bacteria, because his lenses probably weren't good enough to see bacteria. But he saw little protists, little things like amoebas and parameciums and euglenas, like little one-celled protozoans. Things that live in the water. We'll see some of them here in a few days. But apparently, nobody had ever seen those things before. And Leeuwenhoek, being kind of the crazy guy he was, he called them beasties. That was like the name he gave them.
Beasties.
Beasties. Because he thought they were little animals. That's what he thought they were. Turns out they're not, but that's what he thought. He thought they were little animals. And so Leeuwenhoek writes up a paper about this, and he sends it to like all the scientists in Europe. And they get it, and they see this from Lowenhoek, and what do they think? This dude's a nut. He didn't know what he's talking about. That's not true. But he just keeps on. He just keeps sending them stuff, man, about talking about these beasties that he's seeing with all these lenses. And eventually, somebody decides to make him shut up, probably. Yeah, we just need to look and see. And sure enough, when they look, there were all these things in the water, things they had never thought about before. That was the beginning of what?
So what did you see? Cell theory.
He saw little one-celled organisms called protists. But that was the beginning of what we call microbiology, which is one of the reasons that a lot of you guys are alive today. Because eventually that led to us understanding what? Disease. Before, if you got, let's say before this, if you had surgery, let's say you were a doctor and you were delivering babies. All right, you would go deliver the baby. Probably didn't even do what before you delivered it. You probably didn't even wash your hands. Okay? And then you might have went to another woman and delivered her baby. You had to wash your hands the whole time. Okay? Say that was going on in hospitals for all kinds of things. The doctors didn't know that what was on their hands.
Germs.
They didn't know about germs. This was the beginning of understanding germs. One of the easiest ways in the ancient world to get sick was to go to a doctor. Okay? It is, but it's a lot better now than it used to be. Okay? One of the easiest ways to die back in the ancient world was to go to a doctor. Okay? Because the doctor probably had on him germs from the people who he had seen before. And they were sick. And he didn't realize, he didn't know germs existed. He didn't know they existed. This was the beginning of an understanding of germs. So this was huge. A lot of us would be dead without this. So this led to discovering bacteria, discovering what causes diseases, discovery of viruses. It all started here. So even though Leeuwenhoek was kind of crazy, this was a huge, huge discovery. And it saved a lot of our lives over time. Yeah.
What chapter are we on?
Chapter 3.
All right.
All right, now eventually, the work of Hooke and Leeuwenhoek and lots of other scientists led to something called the cell theory. When they started figuring out what cells were. The cell theory has 3 main statements in it. And to most of us today, it seems like this should have been obvious. But it wasn't obvious back then. They were building this. Statement number 1 in the cell theory is that all organisms are made out of cells. If something's alive, it has cells in it. They didn't know that before. Number 2, the cell is the basic unit of structure and function. It's the way we've been defining it all semester so far, right? Cell is the basic unit of structure and function. Cells build living things, and whatever living things do, cells do it for them. And the last one, all cells have to come from other cells. Can a cell just come from nowhere? No. There were people who believed that. This seems like an obvious thing, but there was a theory for a long time called the spontaneous generation. No, not combustion. Spontaneous generation. Think about this for a second. Now remember, this is before we understood a lot of stuff. Scientists might have a piece of meat, and they just lay the piece of meat outside. Let it sit for a day or so. No. Let it sit out for a day or so, and then they come back a couple of days later, and there's like little maggots all in it, right? And where did they think the maggots came from?
Steak.
They thought the maggots just grew out of the steak. That they came from nowhere. What did they not see that was there? Where'd the maggots come from?
Eggs.
Eggs laid there by what? Flies. Maggots are baby flies. They couldn't see those eggs. They didn't know they were there. Another thing that you're going to think is really ridiculous, Aristotle, who's like one of the most famous thinkers ever, right? Supposed to be one of the smartest dudes ever, would go to like a stream or a pond, and he would see little tiny baby fish come out of the mud at the bottom of the stream or the pond. What did Aristotle think?
There was a giant
There were mudfish.
He thought the mud made the fish. One of the smartest men who supposedly ever lived thought that the mud made the fish. But what didn't he see that was under the mud? the eggs from the mother fish that had laid them there. He didn't know they were there. Couldn't see them.
He didn't investigate.
He investigated, but in a lot of cases they were too small for him to see with his naked eye, so he didn't know. And people took Aristotle's word, so that idea just went on and on and on. This idea is sort of our understanding of microbiology. Every living thing is made out of cells. Cells are the basic unit of structure and function. All cells have to come from other cells. That's important to know. All right, now, every cell on Earth has these characteristics that we're about to talk about at some point in time in their life. These are characteristics of all cells. It doesn't matter if it's a human, or plant, or fungus, or protist, or bacteria. All cells have these things. Number one, all cells have a membrane, cell membrane. Is that cell membrane like hard or is it liquidy? It's liquidy. What's the job of the membrane?
Keep everything from anything from the cell.
You might think of a cell membrane sort of like a door. Its job is to let some things in, but also to what? Keep some things out. It's selective. Some things can go in and out, some things can't. Every cell has a cell membrane. Every cell has inside the cell this stuff that we call cytoplasm, which is sort of like what? It's sort of like maybe like Jell-O.
Yeah.
It's the stuff that just fills up the cell. It's like the goo inside the cell. It fills up the cell. Every cell has that. Every cell also has little structures called ribosomes. Those are really important. What do they do? They make the proteins. They're the structures that make the proteins. That's important because what do we say proteins do in your body? Proteins do about everything in your body, right? Your skin, your bones, your hair, they're made out of proteins. Your enzymes are made out of proteins. Your organs are mostly made out of proteins. So ribosomes are important. They essentially build you. Yeah.
Are these proteins like proteins you get from food?
Well, you take in. You've all heard this statement: "You are what you eat." Right?
Yeah.
Is that true? Yeah, it sort of is. Okay? Think about this. Let's say Reed goes out and he goes to Burger King after school today. He gets a Whopper. He eats a Whopper.
Chicken fries back.
When he eats that Whopper, most of that burger's made out of protein, right? Reed's gonna digest that protein. He's gonna break it up into what? What can proteins be broken up into? Amino acids. His body does that. Some of those amino acids Reed may use to make energy. He may burn them to get energy. But a lot of the amino acids Reed actually puts back together to make his own what? His own proteins. So Reed ate part of the cow, and where are those pieces of the cow now? They are part of Reed. Reed's a cow, okay? Because he ate cows, okay? And that, the same would go if you ate fish or whatever you ate. Some of that food that you ate is used to build you. The proteins that you have, the pieces for those proteins came from what you ate. That's important. So the ribosomes take the amino acids that you bring in through your food and put them together to build your own proteins. Yes, ma'am?
What if you eat carrots all the time? Does that mean I'm a carrot?
It means part of you is made out of the proteins that used to be in the carrots. Yes.
Well,
What
Yeah.
if people? Does that make you a person?
Ew.
Maybe.
That's a good one.
Moving along, though. We're not going too far down that road.
Who asked?
Every cell, at some point in time in their life at least, has DNA. Because DNA is the directions for what?
Protein.
For making the protein. So the DNA tells the ribosomes, hey, I need you to make this protein. Here's how to make it. That's the job of the DNA. Are we going to be making some models, maybe drawing. I don't know if we'll make models or not.
Dang it, why can't you all see first?
Anyway, hold that thought. DNA are the directions for building proteins. Every cell has DNA at some point in time in their life, but you have some cells in your body right now that don't have any DNA. Anybody know what cells those are?
I would guess blood.
Fingernails in your hair.
No,
They're dead though.
why not?
The cells in your body that don't have any DNA are red blood cells. And here's the reason why they think that happened. The nucleus of the cell takes up a lot of space, right? That's where the DNA is at. What's the red blood cell's job?
Carry oxygen through.
Carry oxygen. To carry oxygen, it needs a bunch of that protein that was on your test just a few minutes ago, hemoglobin. It needs a lot of that in there. So they think that red blood cells get rid of the nucleus to make more room for what? The hemoglobin. So they're better at carrying the oxygen that they need. What does that mean about making red blood cells? Can red blood cells make more red blood cells? They don't have a nucleus. They can't do mitosis. They can't copy themselves. So where do all your red blood cells come from? They come from your bone marrow. And what happens if something goes bad with your bone marrow? That's bad, right? There's diseases called leukemia and other diseases where there's bone marrow problems. And they are very, very deadly because you can't make more red blood cells without it. All right, one other thing that you may not know about cells, cells have skeletons. Now, we're not talking like bones. They have these little proteins in them that you might think of sort of like a scaffold almost. You guys know what scaffolds are?
No.
Like when they're working on a building or building a building, they put those little metal things that help to hold it up and they can stand on it and work. Or you might think of it this way. When they're building like a new bridge and they're making the poles, the supports for the bridge. What are those poles that hold the bridge up? What are they made out of? Mostly concrete. But inside the concrete are small pieces of what? It's called rebar, but it's like steel, right? And that's in there to make it stronger and to make it supportive and to make it able to bend a little bit, right? Yeah. But also, though, if there's like an earthquake or something, if it was just straight up concrete, what would happen if the earth started shaking? It'd just break, right? With steel in there, steel has a little bend, almost like a tree in the wind, right? It can bend a little bit without breaking. So the rebar is there to make it stronger, it's to make it more elastic. That's what a cytoskeleton is in a cell. It's these little pieces of protein, which help to give it a little bit more strength, make it a little bit more sturdy, make it a little bit more elastic. Those are things that every cell on Earth has. You need to know that list. It's things that all cells have.
The arrows.
Well, what I was saying was this: I'm just trying to tell you what they were. When I drew this arrow when I was defining what it was. But like this one, for example, I said that DNA provides the directions that the ribosomes use to make proteins. All right, now on Earth today, you're going to hear about two kinds of cells on Earth today. Two different kinds. There's prokaryotic and eukaryotic. And this is probably the last thing we'll get to today. The difference between those two things. Two kinds of cells, prokaryotic, eukaryotic. I'm going to oversimplify a bit here, but there's really only one group of organisms on Earth today that have prokaryotic cells. What are they? Bacteria. If you hear the word prokaryote or prokaryotic, the first thing that should come to your mind is bacteria. They're the only things on Earth today that have these kinds of cells, prokaryotic cells, bacteria.
I think that's
All right, now let's think about what that word means for a second. Prokaryotic. I think we talked about that in here before a little bit. If you put P-R-O in front of a word, what does it mean? It means before. Pro means before. And karyo, this little root right here, karyo, actually means nucleus. So the word prokaryote means before the nucleus. Before the nucleus. And here's the deal. What do scientists think came first on Earth?
Bacteria.
They think bacteria came first, right? They were the first living things on Earth. That's the idea. Bacterial cells do not have a nucleus, right? So that's why they're before the nucleus. They came first. They don't have a nucleus, and we'll talk more about that in a second. But let's talk about what a bacterial cell looks like. First of all, it has a membrane, like all cells. And we said the job of the membrane is to do what?
Keep things in there.
Let some things in, keep some things out. Bacterial cells have a wall, also, in addition to a membrane. Where's the wall at in a cell in relation to the membrane?
Inside.
The walls on
Usually the wall's on the outside, and this curvy part might be the membrane. Might be like that. Now, do your cells have walls?
No.
No. What really does a wall do for a cell?
Protection.
Protection, and maybe more importantly, why can you get by without having walls around your cells? What do you have that has the same kind of function?
Hands.
You have a skeleton. It's there for support, strength. It makes you stiff and sturdy and able to stand up. You don't need that because you got all those bones and the skeleton to help you do that.
That one's easy.
It depends on what kind of plant it is. Like all cells, bacterial cells, prokaryotic cells have cytoplasm. Do they have DNA? Do bacterial cells have DNA?
Yes.
Yeah, all cells have DNA. And that's what we're saying here. How much DNA is in a bacteria? One little bitty chromosome. It's usually a circle. One circular chromosome. Let's draw it here in red. So bacterial cells have one tiny little loopy chromosome. Compared to how many in each one of your cells? 46. And yours are long and linear. They have one little short loop one. Their DNA is just sort of doing what? It's floating out in the cell. It's not what? It's not contained. Your DNA is contained, right? It's got a membrane around it that it's sort of, I know this guy who teaches a similar class, and he calls DNA the $1 million blueprint. Why might you call DNA the $1 million blueprint? It's the blueprint for building what? You. And that's pretty important, right? If you had a set of blueprints worth $1 million, where would you put them? You would put them in a vault, right? You put them in a safe.
A lot of proof things out there.
So your body, your cells, take that really important stuff, the directions for building you, and they put it in a container, okay, which is the cell membrane, right? Or in the nuclear membrane. They put it in the nucleus. Bacteria, though, don't have that. Their DNA is just sort of floating out there. Another thing, what else are they missing that other cells have? What do prokaryotic cells not have that most other cells do have? What vacuoles are an example of what?
Mitochondria.
Mitochondria are an example of what?
Plant cells.
Organelles. All those little pieces in a cell, the little parts that do certain jobs. So prokaryotic cells don't have organelles. So let's be specific here. Let's don't just say they don't have a nucleus. Let's say that bacteria lack an enclosed nucleus, so no enclosed nucleus, and no organelles. And in terms of examples, the only examples I want you to worry about for prokaryotic cells are bacteria. Bacteria are prokaryotes. And then the other thing we'll say about them, compared to other cells, prokaryotic cells are really tiny. Even with a microscope, they're hard to see. Even with a good microscope, they're hard to see. Very, very small. So those are characteristics of bacterial cells. They have a membrane, they have a wall for support, they've got cytoplasm, they have some DNA, but no enclosed nucleus. Their DNA is just floating around. It's usually just one little circle of DNA, one little chromosome. The only examples are bacteria, and compared to other cells, they're really tiny. Here's a picture of a normal bacterial cell. Number one, it's just one single cell, right? It's not a lot of cells put together. This is their chromosome. This is a little loopy thing here in the middle. All these little dots are ribosomes. The green thing in here, the green part, that's the wall. So right in here is the wall. The membrane is sort of tan colored in there. The membrane's right in here. Some bacteria have little flagella or cilia to help them move. You might think of a flagella sort of like what? Maybe a tail, almost like a paddle. You might think of it like a paddle. That's its job, is to help it move. That's your typical bacterial cell. Last thing we will talk about today are the other kinds of cells. The kind you have. Eukaryotic. And here's the deal. What do we just get through saying K-A-R-Y means? Pro meant before. It means nucleus. So here's that word nucleus again. That means nucleus. EU means true. So the word eukaryote means having a true nucleus. We'll talk about that in a second, more about it in a second. Eukaryotic cells have a cell membrane, like all cells do, controls what goes in, what comes out. They have cytoplasm. But what makes them different than eukaryotic or prokaryotic cells? We're going to say they have an enclosed nucleus. Their DNA is in a container. It's enclosed. It's got a membrane that keeps it together. We call that membrane the nuclear membrane. So this nuclear membrane closes up the DNA in a container. Remember, your DNA is in your nucleus if you're eukaryotic. Eukaryotic cells tend to have lots of chromosomes. And those chromosomes, like we said, are linear. So they have lots of linear chromosomes, meaning they're not circles. Your chromosomes aren't circles. And your cells have lots of little organelles. What are some examples of organelles? Okay, wait, somebody said vacuoles earlier. What did somebody else say earlier? An example of an organelle. Mitochondria. I heard ribosomes. All cells have ribosomes. They're not really considered at least an enclosed organelle, but you might put chloroplast in there. You could put the ER, the endoplasmic reticulum. We'll talk about lots of other organelles later. But let's end what we're going to talk about today by talking about why organelles are important. Let's say that I gave James over there all the parts needed to build a car. I gave him every piece. And I said, James, you got a couple of hours.
Even the washers.
Every piece. And I come back, James, you got a couple of hours. When I come back, I want that car to be put together, and I want to drive it off this campus. How many of you would be willing to drive that car if James put it together?
I'd rather be short.
I would. Okay. Here's the thing. If you're a bacterial cell, that's sort of what you have to do. Because the bacterial cell is just a cell, right? And that one cell has to be able to do what? Everything. Okay? But in your cells, in eukaryotic cells, there's a lot of little pieces inside, right? And what does each little piece inside do? Each one of these organelles has one job, right? And they become really what? Really good at that one job. Which means, really when you put a car together, they put them together on an assembly line, right? Does probably anybody in that factory know how to build a whole car? Probably not. But they know how to put on a tire or screw in a certain screw or install a radio. They know how to do that one job really well, which increases what about that factory? It increases the efficiency. Okay? Each job, the jobs all get divided up. Each piece, each organelle becomes really specialized at doing a certain job, and that makes the cell work better as a whole. That's the advantage of having an organelle. It's about dividing up the work and specializing, increasing efficiency. That's what makes our cells a little bit better. In terms of examples, what kinds of things have eukaryotic cells? What kinds of organisms have eukaryotic cells? Everything on Earth except what?
Bacteria.
Except bacteria. So we're talking animals, plants, fungus, protists. Everything on Earth except bacteria, they all have eukaryotic cells. And in terms of size, all we're going to say about size is they're a lot what? They're a lot bigger than what? Bacterial cells. They're a lot bigger than prokaryotes. Eukaryotic cells are way bigger than prokaryotic cells. Are there any cells you can see, individual cells, without a microscope? Are there any human cells that you can see without a microscope? Individual human cells. I want to tell you that some of you have some cells that you can see without a microscope. Some of you don't. Some of you have these cells, some of you don't. So what kind of cells am I talking about? Some of you have and some of you don't. The egg cells in a woman. You can see them, okay? If you were to take where are the eggs at?
Back up.
There you go. He knows about his women. They're in the ovaries, right? So if you were to slice up a woman's ovary and put it up microscope size, and you can actually hold it up to the light. You can hold up the light. You can actually see and count egg cells in there. They're really big. Okay. That's how we learn. Okay. Could you do that with sperm cells? No. They are tiny.
Yes.
Tiny, tiny. No way you can see them without a scope. There's a lot of reasons for that. We'll get into why eggs need to be bigger than sperm later. Okay, they have to be for it to work. But here's the deal. Make sure you know that these are all characteristics of eukaryotic cells. They have a true nucleus, cell membrane. Brandon, what do you want to say about it? They have cytoplasm. They have an enclosed nucleus with lots of chromosomes that are linear. Lots of organelles to divide up the work and specialize and increase efficiency. In terms of examples, everything except bacteria, and they are way bigger than bacterial cells. Is there a question?
Doesn't plants have a cell wall?
Plants do. Lots of other things do too. It's not just plants. All right, let me turn off the recording here for a second.